Hey guys, Pastor Joe here, and today we're going to be looking at a portion of the Bible lesson from our third week in the Faith in an Anxious World series. And this week we're going to be talking specifically about the hurting world and kind of how we respond to hopeless situations. And our passage is going to deal with that. We're going to meet some individuals who are in hopeless situations, and it's a longer passage, so we're breaking it up a little bit. And so we're going to be in Luke chapter 8 today. And so if you want to turn there, I'll give you a second here and I will read our passages. We're going to be in verses 40 to 42, and we're going to pick back up again in verse 49 and read through 46. So this is the Gospel of Luke, starting in chapter 8. It says, "When Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they had been waiting for him. A man named Jairus, who was a synagogue leader, he was the church leader of the day, he came and fell at Jesus' feet. He pleaded with Jesus to come to his house because his only daughter, who's 12 years old, was dying. So as Jesus moved forward, he faced smothering crowds." And then we pick back up a few verses later after Jesus interacts with somebody else, and we'll get to that on Sunday. It says, "While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the synagogue leader's house saying to Jairus, 'Your daughter has died. Don't bother the teacher any longer.' When Jesus heard this, he responded, 'Don't be afraid. Just keep trusting, and she will be healed.' When he came to the house, he didn't allow anyone to enter with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. They were all crying and mourning for her. But Jesus said, 'Don't cry. She isn't dead. She's only sleeping.' They laughed at him because they knew she was dead. Taking her hand, Jesus called out, 'Child, get up.' Her life returned, and she got up at once. He directed them to give her something to eat. Her parents were beside themselves with joy, but he ordered them to tell no one what had happened." So in our passage today, we see Jairus, who's this synagogue leader. Synagogue is like a Jewish church. He's the leader of this synagogue, and he runs to Jesus, somebody who kind of was, at that time, was a synagogue disruptor as he goes proclaiming the message of the Messiah. And so we don't know if those two had interacted before, if they had crossed paths, if Jesus has taught in Jairus' synagogue, but Jairus is the synagogue leader, and he runs to Jesus because his daughter is dying. He is in a hopeless situation. But Jesus is surrounded by these crowds. And as Jairus is just falling on his face, he's pleading before him, Jesus gets interrupted by somebody else. And we'll get to that on Sunday night as we get back to this passage. And by the time he gets back to Jairus, somebody from Jairus' house had run to him. Maybe it's a family member, maybe somebody who works in his house. But he runs to Jairus and says, "Your daughter has died. Don't bother the teacher any longer." And how would you have felt if you were Jairus in those moments? Not only are you finding out your daughter has died, your only daughter, but now you're bothering the teacher? You're a nuisance? You're grieving and you're a nuisance? Have you ever felt that way before? Things are feeling hopeless and helpless, and you just don't know what to do. And whatever it might be, you're thinking about asking for help. You're going to ask for help. But as you do that, you're told by maybe a friend, a family member, somebody you really look up to, if you do that, you're just going to bother people. You're just become more of a nuisance. Sometimes that happens in life. And when that does, we can feel very hopeless. You can feel like, why bother? Like, things are just crappy. But there's a couple things I want us to focus on today. First, we see that Jesus stops in his tracks for Jairus. There's actually two women in this longer story, and Jesus stops in his tracks for both of them. And there's an older woman who's sick, and then there's Jairus' daughter who's 12. And then, in a society, in a culture where women weren't very valued, Jesus stops and values them. And it's kind of like he's saying to his disciples and he's saying to the crowds, wherever he's going, it's not as important as the people who are in front of them. So Jesus stops his tracks for those who are hurting. And at the same time, also want you to know that when you are hurting, you are Jesus' top priority. Sometimes other people, even friends, family members, just like the person from Jairus' house, they can miss the cues that we're hurting. And maybe we don't know how to verbalize it, maybe we don't know how to communicate it or write it out. And they kind of miss the cues that we're in pain. But I just want to encourage you today that Jesus never misses those cues. As we go through life, we're going to walk through situations that feel hopeless at times. And maybe you're there right now. Maybe this time in quarantine, it's just kind of feeling hopeless. You're struggling. You haven't been able to see friends. You haven't been able to see family members. You haven't been able to celebrate major life events. Maybe a parent has lost the job. You don't know if they're going to get the job back. Maybe you're sick. Maybe a family member's sick. You could just be feeling very depressed and isolated. But I just want to encourage you that in these moments, know that Jesus cares for you. Know that he will stop in his tracks for you. And know that in your hurting, in your pain, you are his top priority. And Jesus comes to bring life, and life abundant, life that is full, life that is giving, life that is renewing and reviving. And so I just want to encourage you to not live in isolation, to not neglect to reach out. Last week and this week, we're talking about building that circle of individuals that can be there to walk through life with us when we struggle with anxieties. They can be there as mentors in faith. And so reach out to them, call them, pray with them. Most importantly, don't forget to pray yourself. Because Jesus is stopping in his tracks for you. And he cares for you. And he wants to heal you and make you whole.